In this film, you will see selected portions of ground operations for models A and B of the A7 Corsair II. Included are pre-flight servicing, pre-flight exterior inspection, and engine start and post-start checks. These procedures have been extracted from current A7 technical manuals. Squadron personnel should include as a regular part of their jobs the liberal use of these publications. Although this film is intended primarily for plane captains and maintenance personnel, this portion, pre-flight servicing, is essential for A7 pilots who may be required to direct such servicing at off-site bases. Servicing required includes fuel, oil, oxygen, and hydraulic pneumatic systems. First, let's consider fueling. A man must be stationed in the cockpit throughout the fueling operation. Local fire regulations and standard safety rules shall be observed. In the A7, all internal and external tanks may be pressure-filled through a single fueling manifold. Before starting fuel flow, check that the primary and secondary pre-check valves are in normal position. These valves provide automatic shutoff during total refueling. Fuselage and wing defueling valves should also be in normal position. In the cockpit, also check that the fuel dump switch is off. When fuel flow starts, turn the primary pre-check valve to pre-check. Fuel flow should stop within 10 seconds. Repeat this operation for the secondary valve. If all is satisfactory, proceed with fueling. The proper fueling pressure for the A7 is from 30 to 55 psi. Do not exceed 55 psi. Excessive pressure may cause tank rupture. Automatic cutoff will occur when the tanks are full. If tanks are to be only partially filled, a slightly different procedure is followed. External power is connected to activate the fuel gauges. The man stationed in the cockpit monitors the fuel load. When the proper level is reached, he signals for manual cutoff. When pressure fueling equipment is not available, the slower gravity method is used. For gravity fueling, fuselage tanks are filled through a receptacle on the upper fuselage. It is important that the cable attached to the cap be pulled up and hooked in place. This opens a valve that permits all fuselage tanks to be filled. Just forward is a separate receptacle for wing tank fueling. There are 2 oil service items on the A7 which must be checked before every flight. The engine and the constant speed drive. Both are serviced with the same type oil. It is important that the engine oil level be checked as soon as possible after engine shutdown. Otherwise, the reading will be unreliable. Engine oil is checked and serviced at this access door. Raise the security handle and the tank cap handle. Remove the tank cap and read the level on the dipstick. Add oil as required to bring the level up to the proper dipstick mark. When replacing the tank cap, the security handle must be positioned properly so that the cutout in the disc is aligned with the cutout in the door. Otherwise, the cap is not installed properly and the access door will not close. The constant speed drive is checked at this access panel. Do not check the CSD oil level until at least 5 minutes after engine shutdown. Check the sight glass to see that the oil level is in the green range. If service is required, add oil to the filler plug until the sight glass shows the proper level. New lock wire must be installed, and if necessary, replace the O-ring. The A7 uses liquid oxygen, which is serviced at the forward port side. All safety precautions must be observed, and protective clothing must be worn. To service, remove the cap from the fill valve, attach the filler line, and start the flow of liquid oxygen. Continue to fill the converter until overflow occurs at the overboard vent. An alternate procedure is to replace the entire converter with a filled unit. The A7 has hydraulic pneumatic systems which must be checked before every flight. Hydraulic power control systems 1 and 2, and an accumulator pre-charge system. The PC1 reservoir is located in the port wheel well. The PC2 reservoir is located in the starboard wheel well. The two reservoirs have similar indicator windows to show whether or not the system requires service. Refer to the applicable manual and placards on the gear door for complete instructions for checking and servicing these systems. Also located in the starboard wheel well is a single-point filler for the accumulator pre-charge system. At this station, personnel check and service 9 different accumulators or pneumatic reservoirs. Again, the applicable manuals and wheel well placards must be followed in checking and servicing the system. In addition to ensuring that his aircraft has been properly serviced, the plane captain accompanies the pilot on an exterior inspection to see that the aircraft is ready for flight. The pre-flight walk-around should start with a thorough inspection of the intake duct. When the plane captain dives the duct, he looks for foreign objects or debris, loose or missing rivets, and any malformation of the duct area. He goes in far enough to check the engine compressor and the dome. In the nose wheel well, inspect the nose gear steering mechanism. Check the tires. Change the tire if there are any cuts, flat spots, blisters, missing tread, or visible cord. Ensure that the nose gear downlock pin is properly installed. In the starboard avionics bay, check that all circuit breakers are in. Also check that all avionics components are secure in their mountings. Check for general security in the starboard wheel well. The PC2 reservoir should indicate a proper level of fluid. The emergency accumulator isolation valve should be open. Check the brake wear pin. It should protrude from the housing. Check general condition of the tire and ensure that the gear downlock is properly installed. Walk down the starboard wing. Check the leading edge flaps and pylons for any visible damage. There should be no evidence of hydraulic or fuel leakage. Check the lights for any damage to the lenses. Check the aileron and trailing edge flaps. Open the access and check the CSD oil level in the sight glass. Check that the starboard tail cone latches are flush with the surface. Inspect the tail cone for wrinkles, cracks, or abnormal color. Check general condition of the turbine and temperature probes. Move to the port tail cone latches and check for security. Open the oil service access and check that the cover is properly secured. In the port wheel well, look for hydraulic leakage and general security. Check the fluid level of the PC1 reservoir. The external tank ground refueling switch must be off. The pressure fueling cap must be secure. The primary and secondary fuel pre-check valves must be in the normal position. Check the brake wear pin and the general condition of the tire. Check the gear downlock. Walk along the port wing, inspecting the same items as on the starboard wing. In the port avionics bay, ensure that all avionics components are secure in their mountings. Also check that all circuit breakers are in. Check the liquid oxygen compartment for general security. While boarding, the pilot should check that the 3 static vents are not obstructed. Inspect the general condition of the canopy and the top of the fuselage, including all visible antennas. Before entering the cockpit, check that all safety pins have been removed from the ejection seat. The ejection control safety handles must be down in the safe position. If the pilot is satisfied that the aircraft is ready for flight, he straps in, assisted by the plane captain. Pilot and plane captain teamwork is never more evident than when they must rely on hand signals to communicate. These signals begin with the engine start sequence. During the entire start and post-start sequence, the plane captain must be especially alert for abnormal starts or fire. When start is attained, starting air shuts off automatically, but the hose is left connected until the engine reaches idle RPM. At this time, the pilot signals disconnect. The plane captain relays the signal to the starting unit operator. After start, a series of operational checks begins. The sequence may vary from squadron to squadron. First, the plane captain signals for a check of the emergency accumulator isolation valve. Being careful to avoid the intake, he crosses underneath the fuselage and enters the starboard wheel well. He first checks accumulator pressures, then closes the valve. On completion, he repeats the signal to the pilot. This signal requests the pilot to check the flaps and a resting hook. At this signal, the tail hook is raised, but flaps are left down. Next, the plane captain requests the pilot to check rudder trim. This is followed by a check of aileron trim. A check of the unit horizontal tail is next. When the plane captain requests a check of the viscous dampers, the pilot checks the control stick for the proper response and feel. Next, a check of the aileron rudder interconnect. The plane captain requests a cycle of the emergency power pack, the in-flight fueling probe, and the launch bar. During cycling of any system which requires a close inspection by the plane captain, the pilot is careful to keep his hands away from any control which might inadvertently activate the mechanism. These 3 checks may be performed at the same time the flaps and a resting hook are checked, according to squadron preference. To round out this check, the plane captain signals for retraction, then make sure that each item is in the fully retracted position. When operational checks are concluded, the plane captain asks the pilot if he is ready for the gear downlocks to be removed. Before removing the downlocks, he ensures that they move freely. Any jamming means the gear is unsafe and the downlocks must not be removed. After removal, the locks are displayed to the pilot. Although squadron policy may differ as to time sequence, a final safety check is normally performed before the aircraft leaves the flight line. Finally, the pilot is asked to raise the ejection control safety handle, placing it in the arm position. The aircraft is ready to leave the line. At the end of the flight line, the final check assures that the wings are spread and locked. This film has covered the most important points of A7 pre-flight servicing. Pre-flight exterior inspection, and engine start and post-start checks. More complete details of these procedures are contained in applicable manuals and checklists. Plane captains, maintenance personnel, and pilots should be familiar with these publications. The purpose of this film is to help familiarize pilots with certain flight characteristics of models A and B of the A7 Corsair II. Selected portions of flight operations include taxi, takeoff, normal flight maneuvers, stalls and spins, in-flight refueling, and landing. During taxi, the A7 uses nose gear steering for directional control. The system is also used during initial takeoff roll and during final landing roll. Since only 6 degrees of rudder and rudder pedal movement are available with the flaps up, flaps must be down in the A7A, or more than 20 degrees down in the A7B for full nose gear steering. To avoid placing undue strain on the system, engage nose gear steering with the aircraft rolling straight and the rudder pedals in the neutral position. Also, differential braking should be avoided with nose gear steering engaged. Nose gear steering will automatically disengage if more than 60 degrees wheel displacement is attempted. Power and differential braking will be required to bring the nose wheel back within steering limits. Since idle thrust is high in the A7 aircraft, pilots may have a tendency to ride the brakes during taxi. It is better to establish a pattern of alternate acceleration and braking instead of pumping the brakes. This procedure dissipates brake heat more efficiently than a constant braking pressure. Overheating the brakes will cause a fusible plug to blow, releasing all air pressure from the tire. It is also important to cycle the control surfaces every 2 to 5 minutes during extended taxi or when parked with the engine running. This prevents overheating the hydraulic system. By the time the A7 reaches the duty runway, pilots will normally have completed the takeoff checklist mounted in the forward right side of the instrument panel. If all is in order, align the aircraft with the runway, hold the brakes, and recheck the compass heading. Then, advance the throttle to military for a final check. With the control stick, wipe out the cockpit while checking hydraulic pressure. Pressure will fluctuate, but must return to normal when control movement stops. Check engine instruments, making sure that engine pressure ratio equals or exceeds the preset value. Check the oil pressure. Ensure that all caution and warning lights are off. If there are any improper indications, return to the flight line. During takeoff and landing, the A-7 has adequate directional and lateral control to cope with moderate 90-degree crosswinds. Nose gear steering is used until the aircraft reaches a speed of about 50 knots, at which time the rudder becomes effective. Some wing rocking may be induced, especially with control augmentation engaged. The gear must be raised before airspeed reaches 220 knots. Flaps must be raised at a minimum of 100 feet altitude in a positive climb. Minimum speed for safe flap retraction is dependent on gross weight. Below 33,000 pounds, it is 175 knots. Above 33,000 pounds, 205 knots. If flaps are retracted below recommended speeds, it may not be possible to arrest sink. A variable flap capability is incorporated in the A-7B. Allow 8 seconds after the landing gear indicates up to ensure that the gear doors are locked. Then place the flap handle in ISO. During acceleration, such as the initial part of the climb after takeoff, it may be necessary to adjust the throttle to keep the turbine inlet temperature within limits. The A-7 generally has excellent flight characteristics throughout its design performance envelope. It is, of course, subject to certain maneuvering limitations. In dives, the aircraft gains speed rapidly up to about Mach 0.9. Throughout the dive, stability and control are generally good. However, below 10,000 feet and above Mach 0.92, aileron and UHT effectiveness are partially reduced due to airflow separation across the control surfaces. For example, when using high G to pull out of high Mach dives, overstress can occur as the aircraft decelerates back through Mach 0.92 and full UHT effectiveness is regained. Also, roll rate decreases to 50 degrees per second under similar conditions, or about 1/4 of the normal roll rate available at lower airspeeds. Some rudder trimming is necessary in high-speed dives. A-7 roll characteristics vary primarily according to aircraft speed. At low speed, rolls are accompanied by some adverse yaw and some nose-down pitch. These effects decrease proportionately as speed increases. During rolls at high subsonic and transonic speeds, no yaw is experienced, but there will be slight nose-up pitch. External stores have a minor effect on roll rate. The difference, average armament load, is only slightly noticeable. However, with external stores, there is a tendency to overshoot when recovering from full aileron rolls. The characteristics of rolling pullouts, in which rolls are accompanied by G-forces, differ according to speed. Low-speed, low-G rolling pullouts are fairly smooth, but may be accompanied by some adverse yaw. Roll rate, initially high, will decrease with adverse yaw. High-speed rolling pullouts are smoother than those at low speed. The structural limit of the aircraft will be reached before buffeting or adverse yaw become major factors. To avoid this overstress, Caution should be exercised when performing rolling pullouts at low altitude with load factors in excess of 3 Gs. Under these conditions, the aircraft's tendency to pitch is directly proportional to rate of roll. Therefore, execute all rolls at a moderate rate. Keep in mind that the accelerometer is located above the aircraft roll axis and therefore indicates less than the true load factor during rolls. The error can be as much as 1 G. What are the stall characteristics of the A7? In a cruise condition, first warning of an impending stall is a very light airframe buffet, starting at approximately 16 to 17 units angle of attack. As angle of attack increases to 20 1/2 units, a rudder pedal shaker gives positive warning of an imminent stall. This is a service change and may not yet be incorporated in all A7s. At the stall point, which occurs at approximately 25 units, a mild yaw and roll-off occurs. By releasing stick back pressure, recovery takes place immediately and smoothly. In the landing configuration, pre-stall buffet may not be noticeable, but again, the rudder pedal shaker provides positive warning at 20 1/2 units angle of attack. The stall point in the landing configuration is 23 units. By applying power and decreasing the angle of attack to 17 1/4 units, recovery is immediate. To recover from an extremely steep attitude at or near a stall condition, retard throttle to idle, neutralize the controls, and allow the aircraft to fall through without using ailerons. Roll and pitch control will be regained as speed increases. Accelerated stalls are characterized primarily by yaw. If excessive G application is maintained, heavy buffet will be followed by abrupt yaw and possibly by roll in the direction of yaw. This is called departure. As the first step in recovery, the AFCS is disengaged to prevent post-spin control surface inputs. Recovery is effected by immediate relaxation of G and by neutralizing the controls. Do not use ailerons until airspeed has increased beyond the buffet zone. If these steps are not taken immediately, a spin will follow. Spins will usually be oscillatory in pitch and roll. If the aircraft is clean, 2 spin modes are possible. The one seen here is quite oscillatory in the pitch and roll axes, with yaw rates between 80 and 100 degrees per second. The second mode is rather flat, with little or no oscillations. Yaw rate will be up to 120 degrees per second. Spin recovery is the same for all modes. Immediately throttle back to idle to avoid a low-energy engine stall. Disengage AFCS and neutralize the controls. Determine spin direction through reference to the turn indicator and apply full aileron in the direction of the spin, matching the turn needle. Apply rudder in the opposite direction with a stick neutral in the longitudinal axis. Yaw rate should reduce to 0 within 2 turns after spin recovery controls are applied. Return the controls to neutral with 1 or 2 inches of forward stick. The aircraft will be in a rather steep dive and may be rolling. Allow the aircraft to roll and dive until speed has increased to over 200 knots before pulling out. Do not exceed 22 units angle of attack during pullout, or a new departure may occur. It will take 6,000 to 8,000 feet to obtain level flight from this attitude. If you don't have the aircraft under control by 10,000 feet, eject. The A7 in-flight refueling system permits complete fueling of all tanks, including drop tanks. Before starting to refuel in flight, make sure the wing fuel transfer switch is in either auto or off. The external tank's transfer switch must be off. To engage the basket, line up behind the tanker and establish a closure rate of 3 to 5 knots. Many pilots find it helpful to pick a reference point on the tanker and fly to that point. rather than trying to fly on the basket. Shutoff is automatic when the tanks are filled. However, monitor the indicators closely and be prepared to ask for a manual shutoff or to disengage from the basket in the event the automatic system malfunctions. Landing procedures for the A7 are conventional. The speed brake automatically retracts as the landing gear is lowered. A landing checklist is posted on the forward left-hand instrument panel. On touchdown, the A7 has a tendency to rock forward. Use aerodynamic braking by holding the nose wheel off the runway up to 19 units angle of attack. Beyond, the tail cone will drag. After the nose wheel drops through, continue to apply stick back pressure, since the UHT is still effective in creating drag. When airspeed has decreased to 100 knots, apply constant wheel braking. Above 50 knots, use aileron and rudder for directional control. When the aircraft has slowed to taxi speed, nose gear steering may be engaged. It is imperative that the rudder pedals be neutral before nose gear steering is engaged. Otherwise, the nose gear will abruptly deflect in the direction of rudder pedal deflection. The purpose of this film was to familiarize pilots with some of the characteristics of the A7 Corsair II aircraft. Covered in this film were taxi, takeoff, normal flight maneuvers, stalls and spins, in-flight refueling, and landing. Additional information will be found in applicable manuals. Pilots must become familiar with these publications.
Now you've completed your field carrier landing practice, and you're ready to apply what you've learned ashore to landing on the deck of a carrier. In transposing your skills from the field to the ship, you'll find there are certain differences to take into consideration. You'll have more wind in the groove, but virtually no crosswind. You'll be adjusting to new signals and to conditions where your landing area may pitch and roll. Tire pressures are higher in order to absorb the greater impact of arrested landings. Taxiing requires more power and more braking. Many of these variations will be presented in this film. As you approach the carrier to enter the brake, parallel the base recovery course, or Fox Korpen, close aboard the starboard side at 800 feet. Your hook should be up for touch and goes, down for an arrested landing. If your interval is past the 90-degree position, brake just forward of the bow. When taking interval on other aircraft already established in the pattern, brake when the A7 or A4 ahead of you is at your 730 position. For any other aircraft, including props, your 7 o'clock position. When braking out of formation, take a 17-second interval on the aircraft ahead. Entering the brake, 250 knots indicated airspeed is optimum if single, 300 knots for a section or more. After braking, slow to 220 knots, dirty up and descend to the pattern altitude of 500 feet when wings level downwind. On the downwind leg, complete the landing checklist. Cross-check angle of attack at 17.5 units for proper airspeed. Once you have determined your angle of attack is correct, engage and check your APC if you're using it in your approach. Look for the proper abeam position, 1¼ miles. Don't rely on the aircraft ahead of you. He could possibly be out of position. The best guide is to use TACAN DME until you have calibrated your eye as to the relative size of the ship at the proper distance abeam. Under optimum wind conditions of 30 knots, you will start your turn off the 180, abeam the LSO platform. For winds in excess of 35 knots, start the turn abeam the island. For lighter wind conditions or APC approaches, turn later on an extension of the ramp position. Make a level instrument turn off the 180 through the 90-degree position using 25 to 27 degrees of bank. Start looking for the meatball between the 90 and the 45. Do not start your descent without a ball. Wings level in the groove with proper lineup will put you slightly starboard of the wake. Call the ball when you see it, or Clara if you don't have it by the time you level your wings at the start.
Tack saddle 524, Corsair, manual ball, state 42, Davis.
If you're using APC, report auto ball. Once you've acquired the meatball, you're somewhere within 3/4 of a degree of optimum glide slope. From that point on, keep your eye on the ball all the way. Keep it in the center and make any necessary corrections as far out as possible. Maintain optimum angle of attack all the way to touchdown. Keep lined up with the angled deck. Crab slightly starboard to compensate for the movement of the ship, which is on a course 10 degrees right of your track in the groove. On an airfield, the angle of the glide slope is approximately 3 degrees. But this, in conjunction with the increased wind at the ship, is not enough slope for hook-to-ramp clearance in carrier landings. So the angle is increased to 3.5 degrees, or 4 degrees for ships of lesser ramp-to-wire distances, or when unusually high wind conditions occur. The resultant effect of natural and ship-made wind is a 30-knot headwind in the groove. Your aircraft is actually closing the ship at approximately 100 knots. Therefore, your rate of descent is less. This essentially shallows your glide slope, and you'll find you're using more power at the ship. So keep your eye on the ball all the way to touchdown. Don't spot the deck, or you're asking for trouble. Now let's get out of animation and back to the real world. Arriving at the carrier, you follow the pattern we've just discussed. Make a level break just forward of the bow. Dirty the plane at 220 knots and descend to pattern altitude of 500 feet when wings level downwind. Start your final turn 1.25 miles abeam the LSO platform. Pick up the ball and keep it centered as you follow the glide slope all the way to the deck. On touchdown, advance the throttle to full power. As forward motion ceases, reduce power to idle and allow the aircraft to roll back. Raise the hook at the completion of the rollback. Add power in anticipation of taxiing clear of the landing area, holding your brakes until given the come ahead. Hold the wings on the director's signal. When the come-ahead signal is received, release brakes and taxi clear of the landing area. Use brakes for directional control until nose wheel steering is available. Taxi the aircraft as directed, but do not use excessive power. Usually, a maximum of 70% will be enough to counteract the effects of jet blast or high wind as you taxi to the catapult. Follow the director's signals at all times. If you're waiting behind the blast deflector for launch, hold the nose steering button engaged. Brakes on. This will prevent the aircraft from swinging around or sliding due to wind or jet blast. Check the weight board to verify the gross weight. Your takeoff checklist should be complete before taxiing onto the catapult. UHT is trimmed 4 degrees nose up. Approach the cat track slowly. Ride the brakes lightly and evenly. Nose gear steering should be engaged. Follow the plane director's signals closely to align the aircraft with the cat. As the aircraft moves forward, the holdback assembly is installed. When the plane is properly aligned, the director will signal the pilot to drop the launch bar. Then, as the holdback assembly stops the aircraft, the launch bar drops into the shuttle. Disengage the nose steering on the director's signal. Do not use it after the launch bar is positioned in the track. When you're lined up with the cat, align the compass with the base recovery course. At light fuel weight, a one-finger turn-up may be required to depress the nose strut and allow the launch bar to drop into the shuttle. When you receive the signal to take tension, go to full power. Release the brakes. The launch bar switch should be off. Check EPR and other engine instruments. On the A7A, engage the bleed switch. The EPR drop should be about 0.17. Make sure the launch bar light is out. Then make final visual checks. Cat grip and friction lock. Yaw stab on. Control AUG off. When you're ready to launch, position your head against the headrest and salute. No rotation is necessary at the end of the cat stroke, but ensure that you have the proper attitude of 10 degrees nose up, at least the minimum end speed for your gross weight, and not more than 18 units of angle of attack. When you're comfortably airborne, drop your hook. While climbing to pattern altitude of 500 feet, check for interval. 8 o'clock on another A7 or A4, 7 o'clock on all other aircraft. Again, if your interval is past the 90, a turn crosswind is permissible once you're airborne, but keep climbing to 500 feet. Naturally, an unsatisfactory approach rates a wave-off. If the wave-off lights flash or paddles tells you to wave off, it is mandatory that you take the wave-off. Remember that the ship has arresting gear, so it's important that you level your wings and maintain your lineup as you advance power. It's also imperative that you do not over-rotate the aircraft, as this could result in an in-flight engagement. Maintain the optimum angle of attack. If you bolter, full power on touchdown gives you the necessary thrust to rotate to optimum angle of attack at the end of the deck. On both wave-off and bolter, once you're past the bow of the ship, turn right to parallel the Fox Scorpion. But be careful not to cross the bow. At other times, you'll be involved in hot switching. Always wear your hard hat. Use tinted or clear visor as appropriate. Wear gloves on the flight deck during operations. The switch pilot should always check tires, brake pins, and the aircraft for any obvious leaks. While doing this, avoid the intake and tailpipe areas. If you're the pilot being relieved, do not unstrap until the aircraft is chocked and tied down with 3 chains. When the aircraft is tied down and the switch pilot is at the aircraft, pull down the head knocker, install the canopy strap, unplug the oxygen mask hose, hand the knee board to the plane captain, unstrap, and dismount. On the way out, make sure you don't hit the throttle or pop the bailout bottle with your feet or flight gear. The same caution applies to the switch pilot as he mounts and moves into the cockpit. Hold the brakes and strap in. No post-start checks are required, but the takeoff checklist should be completed, except for wings and compass alignment. After returning from a mission, keep the engine running until chocks, downlocks, and at least 3 tie-downs are installed. Execute a normal shutdown when the cut signal is received. Control the canopy opening rate by holding rails with both hands, and install the canopy strap immediately. Always raise flaps prior to a shutdown, even underway on the hangar deck. When you're on the hangar deck, remove your hard hat immediately after shutdown in order to hear whistle signals from the director. Once you've stopped, hold the brakes until the plane is tied down. Remember, you have a maximum of 5 brake applications after shutdown, so keep your hand on the emergency brake handle. When preparing for launch aboard ship, there are certain procedures essential to your safety. You should know the bingo or divert field, ship's weather, ship's PIM, aircraft assignment, spot, and gross weight. On deck, conduct a normal pre-flight. Inspect tires for cuts and bruises, struts for proper inflation, hook point for grease, and look for possible cable damage to the underside of the aircraft. If the aircraft is spotted with the tail over the catwalk, it may not always be possible to make a complete inspection of the aft fuselage. Mark the gross weight of the aircraft on each nose gear door. Post-start checks are the same as on the beach, except the launch bar is checked, and you may not be able to drop the tail hook if the tail is over the catwalk. When the takeoff checklist is complete, report up with your gross weight to the tower.
Tax settle 524 up, gross weight 22.5. 524, roger.
When up transmission is acknowledged, give the yellow shirt a thumbs up, indicating you're ready to taxi. The head knocker should be up anytime the aircraft is not tied down. Flaps should be down for nose wheel steering. Don't spread your wings until you get a signal from the director. The procedures for daytime operations also apply to night operations, but the pace is slightly reduced to compensate for reduced visibility. Instead of hand signals to the pilot, the deck crew uses lighted wands. On night operations, use a red flashlight to conduct exterior pre-flight. If more light is required, borrow a signal wand or a white lens flashlight. Make sure the exterior light switches are properly positioned for launch. Bright and steady, approach and carrier, collision light off. The master exterior light switch should be off, and the taxi light switch should be off prior to start. The instrument light rheostat should be out of the off position to reduce the brilliance of the warning and advisory lights when the generator comes on the line. For post-start, adjust the cockpit lights as desired and perform the system functional checks. At night, the aircraft should be handled slowly and carefully by both directors and pilots. If there's any doubt about the safety of the operation or the plane director's signal, stop the aircraft. At night, it is difficult to determine speed or motion over the deck, so always follow the director's signals closely. Directors should remain stationary so pilots can use them as guides for taxi speed. The plane director will position himself forward of the aircraft and remain stationary as you approach the catapult. Use him as a visual reference. As you approach the cat, check the weight board. A horizontal wave with a flashlight means lower the weight. If the weight figure should be increased, the signal would be up and down. When it's okay, the signal is a series of circles. Now you perform all cockpit checks prescribed for launch. When you're satisfied the aircraft is ready for launch, establish an instrument scan: gyro, airspeed, rate of climb, angle of attack. Then turn the master exterior light switch on. Be prepared to establish a wings level, climbing attitude on instruments. An initial 10 degrees nose-up attitude is recommended. Check for minimum end speed, proper angle of attack, a positive rate of climb, and the altimeter climbing. If a no-go situation arises, leave the exterior lights as they are and transmit to pry fly.
Suspend Cat 2.
Always maintain full power and scan until the catapult officer walks in front of the wing and gives the signal to reduce power. Then turn off lights and reduce power for pushback. Night and instrument recoveries will normally be made utilizing TACAN and CCA procedures in accordance with the CVA-CVS NATOPS manual. Remember, there is more conversation on the recovery frequency at night, so keep your transmissions to a minimum. Acknowledge with side number only. After arrestment, immediately turn the master external light switch off. Taxi out of the landing area slowly. Do not stare at the plane director's wands, but keep them in sight at all times. Use him as a speed and direction reference. Occasionally, during carrier operations, certain difficulties may arise for which you should be prepared. If you get hung up in the gear, reduce power, drop the hook when directed, release brakes, and allow the aircraft to be pulled back. Raise the hook again on signal. Often on rollback after landing, the nose wheel may swivel 180 degrees. Use your brakes for initial directional control and engage nose wheel steering after forward motion is established. Some pilots like to prevent this situation by engaging nose wheel steering on rollout and holding it during rollback. If you lose your radio on an approach, make normal transmissions in the blind. To indicate radio failure at night, switch lights to bright and flash. The LSO will utilize the green cut lights, first as an acknowledgement to you that he has control, later as a call for power. If you should lose one or both brakes while taxiing, inform the tower and lower tail hook immediately to indicate brake loss to the plane director. Don't discount the use of nose wheel steering to deck loop. Attempt to stop the aircraft with the emergency brakes. At night, also turn the external master light switch back on. Anytime you're on the cat and conditions develop so that you do not want to go, shake your head from side to side and transmit suspend on UHF. Never raise your hand for any reason when you're on the cat, except to salute. But always be prepared to go until given the throttle back signal by the catapult officer in front of the wing. Making a successful landing on a carrier may seem to be more difficult than coming in to land on a runway ashore. The landing area is in motion and is subject to the effects of wind and sea. However, as you build experience around the ship, you will begin to realize that there are certain advantages to carrier operations. You have more time to make corrections. Your closing rate on the landing area is 30 knots slower. Your actual glide path is shallower. You're operating in a more responsive power range. The arresting gear stops you quickly and surely. A blown tire or loss of brakes is no problem. There is seldom a crosswind, and if you do have some kind of problem requiring crash crew assistance, the crew is just a few quick steps away. Concentration is required. A finer attention to all details is necessary. But landing aids have been proved and procedures have been developed to aid you. Be continually aware of the differences in shipboard operations and follow the prescribed procedures. Your safety and the safety of your shipmates depends on your knowing what to do and when to do it.
Is the A-7. It is an attack aircraft. The purpose of every attack aircraft is to provide a stable weapons platform for ordnance delivery. In order to use it effectively, you, the pilot, must know and practice the correct principles of weapons delivery. The purpose of this film is to review the principles. Before starting a discussion of the principles of ordnance delivery, it is important that certain terms be fully understood. For example, all aircraft have a longitudinal line used as a base reference for all other lines in this axis. On the A-7, this line is called waterline 100. On other aircraft, it is sometimes called the fuselage reference line. All aircraft have an armament datum line, or ADL. This is a zero reference line for all weapon stations on the aircraft. On the A-7, the ADL is depressed 2.85 degrees below waterline 100. With the gun sight set at 0 mils, that line from the pilot's eyes through the gun sight pipper is the zero sight line. Any setting from 0 to 262 mils may be selected on the gun sight. As the gun sight is depressed, the pilot's line of sight drops accordingly. Let's take a closer look at the gun sight to define the term mil. Mil stands for mil-radian, a unit of angular measurement. If an angle of 1 mil is projected through the gun sight to a distance of 1,000 feet, it will cover an object 1 foot high. Similarly, a 10 mil angle will cover a 10-foot object at a distance of 1,000 feet from the gun sight. Several factors must be considered in arriving at the proper mil setting or line of sight for a given delivery situation. These include 3 angles. First is the angle between the zero sight line and the armament datum line. This is always 15 mils and will remain constant for any weapon delivery. The second is the angle between the ADL and the flight path. This is referred to as the angle of attack of the ADL. The mil value of this angle varies according to airspeed, gross weight, G-load,
and density altitude. The third angle is formed by the trajectory drop of the weapon. When a bomb is released from an aircraft, it becomes a free-falling body affected by gravity. The magnitude of its drop, or vector, is called trajectory drop. Again, the mill value of this angle is variable. The sum of these angles thus becomes the line of sight, or mill setting. Specific settings for each weapon and type delivery is available in the tactical manual. In order to place the ordnance accurately on the target, initially, the line of sight is short of the target. As the aircraft continues its dive, the line of sight moves toward the target. As it intersects the target, the weapon is released. Now, let's observe how the sight setting is used in typical bomb delivery maneuvers. An overall picture of a typical conventional bombing situation can be visualized as a cone of flight paths, with a target directly below the apex. Critical points on the cone are the entry altitude and the release altitude. The method of entering the dive is dictated by the tactical situation. However, the basic maneuver is a level, banked turn to intercept a point 20 to 30 degrees short of the roll-in heading. At this point, increase the angle of bank to about 120 degrees and establish the predetermined dive angle. A proper roll-in is executed quickly with a minimum loss of altitude, because altitude lost in this maneuver subtracts from essential tracking time. Now, what should the initial sight picture be following roll-in a typical dive delivery? The initial sight picture should be 1/3 the sight setting short and held until reaching 1 1/2 times the release altitude. For example, if sight depression is 90 mils and release altitude is 3,000 feet, on roll-in, the initial sight picture should be 30 mils, or 1/3 the sight depression, short of the target. This sight picture is held until the aircraft reaches 4,500 feet, which is 1 1/2 times the release altitude. The gun sight pipper is then allowed to track toward the target, arriving on target when the aircraft reaches the 3,000-foot release altitude. However, in order to arrive at the proper initial pipper placement, some consideration must be given to pendulum effect during roll-in. Keep in mind that since the line of sight is depressed from the zero sight line, the pipper describes an arc as the aircraft rolls. Assuming a 100 mil sight depression, if the pilot places the pipper on the target before the roll-in is completed, watch what happens as the wings roll level. Instead of rolling around the pipper, the aircraft actually rolls around the zero sight line, which in this case is the upper 100 mil ring. This is pendulum effect. Now, let's back up to the roll-in. This time the pilot will ignore the pipper and instead place the zero sight line at the 12 o'clock position to the target. Then, as wings are rolled level, the proper initial sight picture is established. When the pilot selects a sight setting, he actually selects a specific point in space to release the chosen weapon. This point is determined by dive angle, airspeed, and release altitude. The pilot must maneuver the aircraft to arrive at this predetermined point from which the weapon, when released, will impact the target. Any deviation from pre-planned conditions means the weapon will not be released at the optimum point and will miss the target. A number of common pilot-induced errors are possible between the roll-in maneuver and the release point. The first occurs when the aircraft is not on proper lineup as the roll-in is completed. In this case, the initial sight picture shows the pipper offset from the target. The tendency to correct the error is to forget the pendulum effect when applying lateral corrections. If the pilot banks and holds the bank to bring the pipper over the target run-in line, when he levels the wings, the pipper will be offset in the other direction. Another common tendency in attempting to correct lateral error is to apply a rudder to bring the pipper onto the target. Again, the error has not been corrected. Although the line of sight is on the target, The aircraft is in a skid, and the actual flight path has not changed. And since the bomb follows the aircraft flight path, it will miss the target. Again, let's go back to the initial sight picture. The proper technique is to ignore the pipper, make a brief turn toward the target, level the wings, and recheck the sight picture. Additional corrections may be necessary. Once the proper lineup is established, the pilot must check dive angle, the most critical parameter in arriving at the optimum release point for accurate ordnance delivery. For example, if the dive angle is too steep, when the aircraft reaches release altitude with the pipper on the target, it will be past the optimum release point. As a result, the weapon will impact long. Conversely, if the dive is too shallow, with the pipper on the target, the aircraft will be short of the optimum release point, and the result will be a short impact. To correct a dive angle that is too shallow, pull the nose up slightly until the proper dive angle can be achieved, then reestablish the dive. To correct a dive angle that is too steep, drop the nose slightly until the proper angle can be achieved, then reestablish the dive. If all pre-planned conditions are met, except that the aircraft is flying fast, you will have changed the angle of attack of the armament datum line, which, as you recall, alters the line of sight. Therefore, excessive speed results in a late sight picture and a long impact. Conversely, flying too slow increases the angle of attack of the ADL, resulting in an early sight picture and a short impact. Any deviation in dive angle or airspeed will also affect the trajectory drop of the ordnance as well as line of sight. Another important factor is release altitude. With all pre-planned parameters correct, except that the aircraft is above the optimum release altitude, the weapon will impact short. If the ordnance is released low, the hit will be long. If you arrive at release altitude with the pipper short of the target, pulling the nose up to reposition the pipper will not give a hit, because the angle of attack of the ADL has been changed, and the dive angle has decreased. The ordnance will hit short. If the nose must be held down to keep the pipper on the target, the dive angle has been increased, and the hit will be long. As you approach the release point and errors still exist, it may be possible to compensate. For example, if the aircraft is above a pre-planned 30-degree dive angle, a release 100 feet high should compensate for each degree of steepness. If, during the dive, airspeed is too fast, which would result in a long hit, it is possible to cancel out the error by releasing 100 feet above the optimum altitude for each 10 knots of excess airspeed. Never compensate for a slow airspeed or a shallow dive angle by releasing low because of tactical considerations and bomb fragmentation patterns. Your only possible compensation is to position the pipper beyond the target. Wind velocity at release is also a consideration for accuracy. During the dive, the aircraft has two velocity vectors, forward and downward. In a no-wind condition, the resultant velocity vector is identical with the flight path. At the instant of release, the weapon has the same velocity vector as the aircraft. Immediately after release, gravity increases the downward velocity vector, which alters the resultant velocity vector of the weapon. The difference is the trajectory drop. With a straight headwind, the magnitude of the wind decreases the forward velocity vector of the aircraft by direct subtraction. Headwinds cause the weapon to fall short of the target. Conversely, a straight tailwind will add to the forward velocity vector and cause the weapon to fall beyond the target. Therefore, since they affect the range of the weapon, head and tail winds are referred to as range winds. To compensate for range winds, the pipper must be displaced to an offset aim point. For a headwind, the pipper is displaced to a 12 o'clock position. For a tailwind, it is displaced to a 6 o'clock position. The formula for determining the amount of pipper displacement is 1.69 times the time of fall in seconds times wind velocity in knots. The result is the correction in feet. Only the release altitude wind is used to compute this formula. However, winds from roll-in to release will affect the dive angle. A headwind will decrease the dive angle, while a tailwind increases it. This is compensated for by adjusting the roll-in point. A crosswind tends to deflect the aircraft from its optimum flight path. In this case, a left crosswind, the resultant velocity vector becomes the actual flight path. Therefore, if the pilot has the line of sight on the target, the weapon will follow the flight path of the airplane and will be off target. The proper way of compensating for a crosswind is to establish an initial sight picture with an imaginary aim point offset from the target. The degree of offset can be determined through computation. The formula is the same as for a range wind. Using this formula, the aircraft dive must be planned so that the flight path will intersect the target. When the aircraft reaches release altitude, the pipper will be over the offset aim point and the weapon is released. After release, the weapon will follow the flight path to the target. So far, we have discussed the effects of straight range winds and crosswinds and how to compensate for them. In actual practice, the existing wind will be a combination of these. For example, in a pre-flight briefing, the pilot is told to expect 10-knot winds from 045 degrees. Since his run-in heading will be 090 degrees, he must compensate for both a left wind and a headwind. In this case, 1.69 times 6 seconds time of fall times 10 knots wind velocity equals 100 feet offset aim point. The aim point is established at the 1030 position and offset 100 feet into the wind. The aircraft is allowed to drift until the line of sight intersects the aim point at release altitude. Techniques for accurate delivery of rockets are essentially the same as for free-falling bombs. However, the trajectory of rockets from release to impact must be considered in two phases: powered flight and free-fall flight. Note that during powered flight, the rocket shows negligible trajectory drop. Only at burnout does the rocket assume the characteristics of a free-fall weapon. Because of this, the sight depression for rockets is always considerably smaller than for bombs. Otherwise, dive entry, tracking, and error analysis are essentially the same. Keep in mind that since sight depression for rockets is quite small, the pendulum effect during roll-in is less than that for bombs. We have seen that pre-planned delivery parameters such as release altitude, airspeed, and dive angle should be strictly observed to ensure accuracy. There is another good reason: your safety. That is, safe separation between your aircraft and the effects of the weapon you deliver. For every weapon, a fragmentation pattern has been determined by actual controlled detonations. The basic fragmentation pattern for all weapons consists of beam sprays approximately perpendicular to the longitudinal axis of the weapon, and numerous secondary frag spray patterns, lower but spreading further. Starting at release altitude, follow the action of this delivery sequence, which develops in 1 second increments. Note how observing minimum altitude and airspeed, plus the prescribed recovery maneuver, guarantees safe separation from the fragmentation pattern. If the release altitude is not observed, as in this case, or if the pilot delays his recovery, the result may be disastrous. When aircraft are hitting a target in sequence, it is very important that trailing aircraft observe proper intervals. Otherwise, they risk exposure to the leader's fragmentation pattern. Since a rocket impacts ahead of the firing aircraft, you may be tempted to watch the hit. Don't. If you do, you will fly into the fragmentation pattern or into the ground. During this film, we reviewed certain fundamentals of ordnance delivery. These included sight pictures, sight picture errors, and how to correct them, the importance of adhering to pre-planned release parameters, and how to compensate for deviations, how to compensate for winds at release, rocket delivery techniques, and the importance of observing safe separation conditions. In addition, every pilot should frequently refer to related information contained in the tactical manual. The ability to deliver weapons accurately will come only through a thorough understanding of the principles of ordnance delivery and through experience.